On the rocky coast of Bar Harbor, Maine, there once stood a mansion that most people have never heard of. Chatwold was the summer retreat of Joseph Pulitzer, the man whose name is now synonymous with journalistic excellence. Every year, the Pulitzer Prizes are awarded to the finest work in journalism and the arts. The name carries weight, prestige, honor. But the man who built Chatwold and created that legacy was anything but honorable. He was a pioneer of yellow journalism, the sensationalist, truth-distorting, circulation-chasing style of reporting that prioritized profit over accuracy. He helped push America into an unnecessary war that killed thousands. He weaponized the press to destroy rivals and manipulate public opinion. And in the end, his own creation drove him mad. This is the story of how one man learned to control what millions of people thought, how that power consumed him, and how he spent his final years trapped in a soundproof prison of his own design, unable to bear the noise of the world he had made louder and more chaotic. Joseph Pulitzer was born in 1847 in Hungary to a wealthy Jewish family. But by the time he was 17, his family's fortune was gone, his father was dead, and Joseph was desperate to escape a Europe that offered him nothing. He tried to join various European armies, but was rejected because of his terrible eyesight and frail health. Finally, in 1864, he was recruited by a Union Army agent looking for soldiers to fill Civil War quotas. Pulitzer sailed to America with promises of money and opportunity. The promises were lies. The recruiting bounty he was supposed to receive was stolen by the agent. He was thrown into a war he barely understood, fighting for a country he just arrived in, unable to speak English properly. He survived, barely, and emerged from the war penniless and alone in a strange land. This experience shaped everything that came after. Pulitzer learned early that the world was fundamentally dishonest, that you couldn't trust anyone, and that survival required being more ruthless than everyone else. He also developed an absolute hatred for privilege and establishment power, the comfortable elites who sent poor immigrants to die in their wars while they stayed safe and wealthy. After the war, Pulitzer drifted to St. Louis, where a large German-speaking community gave him a foothold. He did odd jobs, slept in boarding houses, and slowly taught himself English by reading newspapers obsessively. He was brilliant, driven, and absolutely determined to never be poor again. In 1868, at age 21, Pulitzer got a job as a reporter for the Westlich Post, a German-language newspaper. He was a natural. He had an eye for stories that mattered to ordinary people, a gift for dramatic writing, and no respect for the powerful institutions that other reporters treated with deference. Within a few years, he had bought into the paper and was running it. By 1878, Pulitzer had made enough money to purchase the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, combining two failing newspapers into a single publication. And this is where he developed the formula that would make him a millionaire and transform American journalism forever. Give people what they want, not what they need. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch under Pulitzer was unlike anything readers had seen before. It didn't report the news so much as dramatize it. Every story was written to provoke an emotional response: outrage, fear, excitement, titillation. Crime stories were described in lurid detail. Scandals were investigated with relentless aggression. Crusades were launched against corruption, vice, and anyone Pulitzer decided was an enemy of the people. But here's the crucial thing. Pulitzer wasn't doing this out of noble principle. He was doing it because it sold papers. Scandal outsold policy. Crime outsold economics. Moral outrage outsold measured analysis. Pulitzer discovered that if you made people angry enough, scared enough, or entertained enough, they would buy your newspaper every single day. The Post-Dispatch's circulation exploded. Within 5 years, it was the most widely read paper in Missouri. Pulitzer was making money hand over fist, and he was just getting started. In 1883, Pulitzer made his move to the big time. He purchased the New York World from robber baron Jay Gould for $346,000. The World was losing $40,000 a year and seemed like a terrible investment. But Pulitzer saw opportunity where others saw failure. He immediately transformed the World using the same techniques that had worked in St. Louis, but on a much grander scale. The newspaper became a daily assault on the senses. Massive headlines, dramatic illustrations, stories written to shock and entertain. But Pulitzer also added something new, a pretense of crusading for the common man. The World positioned itself as the voice of ordinary New Yorkers against the corrupt elites. It investigated tenement conditions, exposed political corruption, and railed against the power of monopolies and trusts. Pulitzer presented himself as a champion of the working class, fighting for the little guy against entrenched power. And much of this was genuine. Pulitzer really did hate corrupt politicians and robber barons. He really did think the press should hold power accountable. But he also discovered that crusading journalism sold even better than simple scandal. People didn't just want to be entertained. They wanted to feel like they were part of something important, a moral movement, a fight for justice. Pulitzer gave them that feeling while also giving them crime stories, sex scandals, and gossip. It was a brilliant combination, high-minded crusading mixed with lowbrow sensationalism. Readers felt virtuous for buying the World while also being thoroughly entertained. By 1887, the World's circulation had grown from 15,000 to over 250,000. It was the most widely read newspaper in America. Joseph Pulitzer was a millionaire many times over and one of the most powerful men in New York. He could make or break politicians, destroy reputations, shape public opinion on any issue he chose. This is when things started to go wrong. In 1895, William Randolph Hearst bought the New York Morning Journal and declared war on Joseph Pulitzer. Hearst was the son of a mining magnate, obscenely wealthy, and determined to beat Pulitzer at his own game. He immediately began poaching Pulitzer's best staff, offering them salaries the World couldn't match. Then he launched a circulation battle that would push both newspapers to depths of sensationalism that shocked even cynical observers. The competition between Pulitzer and Hearst became known as the Yellow Journalism era, named after a popular comic strip character called the Yellow Kid that both papers fought over. But the competition was anything but comic. It was a race to the bottom, with each newspaper trying to outdo the other in scandal, sensation, and outright fabrication. Crime stories became more lurid. Illustrations became more shocking. Headlines grew larger and more dramatic. But most importantly, both newspapers began to simply make things up. If a story wasn't dramatic enough, reporters were encouraged to embellish. If facts didn't support the narrative, facts could be changed. If an event wasn't newsworthy, it could be staged. Pulitzer knew this was happening. He knew his reporters were exaggerating, fabricating, and distorting the truth. But he also knew that Hearst Journal was doing the same thing, and if the World didn't keep up, it would lose circulation. So he let it continue, telling himself that the crusading journalism, the real investigations, the genuine corruption exposés, justified the sensationalism. But he was losing control. The World had become a machine designed to sell papers at any cost, and that machine was increasingly running itself. Editors knew what Pulitzer wanted: circulation numbers, advertising revenue, market dominance. How they achieved those goals was becoming less and less subject to his oversight. And then came Cuba. In 1895, Cuba revolted against Spanish colonial rule. It was a brutal conflict, with Spanish forces trying to suppress the rebellion through harsh tactics. American business interests were affected. Many Americans owned sugar plantations in Cuba, but the conflict was essentially a colonial war that had nothing to do with the United States, except that it was a perfect story for yellow journalism. You had oppressed freedom fighters, brutal European colonizers, suffering civilians, and American business interests at stake. Both the World and the Journal threw themselves into covering the Cuban rebellion with a fervor that had little to do with truth and everything to do with circulation. The coverage was relentlessly pro-Cuban and anti-Spanish. Every Spanish action was portrayed as an atrocity. Every rebel claim was reported as fact. Stories of Spanish brutality were embellished, exaggerated, or simply invented. The most famous example was the Journal's coverage of Evangelina Cosio y Cisneros, a Cuban woman imprisoned by the Spanish. Hearst's paper claimed she was an innocent young girl thrown into a prison with hardened criminals. The truth was more complicated, but the Journal's version sold papers. Pulitzer's World was just as bad. It ran stories about Spanish concentration camps, brutal torture, and systematic rape. Some of these stories had a basis in truth. The Spanish oppression was indeed harsh. But the World presented these stories with such dramatic flair, such obvious emotional manipulation, that truth became secondary to impact. Both newspapers began openly calling for American intervention. They portrayed it as a moral imperative. How could America stand by while innocent Cubans were slaughtered by European tyrants? The fact that both Pulitzer and Hearst stood to profit enormously from a war, nothing sells papers like warfare, was conveniently unmentioned. The breaking point came in February 1898, when the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 266 American sailors. The cause of the explosion was unclear. It could have been an accident, sabotage, or Spanish action. An investigation was needed. The World and the Journal didn't wait for an investigation. Both immediately blamed Spain, despite having no evidence. The warship Maine was split in two by an enemy's secret infernal machine, screamed the Journal's headline. The World was only slightly more restrained, but equally certain that Spain was responsible. The coverage was relentless, hysterical, and completely divorced from factual evidence. Both papers published diagrams showing how Spanish mines must have destroyed the Maine. They printed testimonies from experts who confirmed Spanish guilt. They ran editorials demanding war, vengeance, blood, and the American public, consuming this propaganda daily, began demanding war too. Remember the Maine became a rallying cry. Politicians who had been reluctant to intervene in Cuba found themselves under enormous pressure from constituents who had been whipped into fury by yellow journalism. In April 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. It was a short war. Spain was weak and disorganized, and American victory was never really in doubt. But thousands of people died. Spanish civilians were killed. Cuban civilians were killed. American soldiers died, many of them from disease in camps that were unprepared for tropical warfare. The Philippines, also a Spanish colony, was invaded and then faced a brutal insurgency when Filipinos discovered that liberation meant American occupation rather than independence. And through it all, the World and the Journal reported with triumphant nationalism, treating the war like a sporting event their editorials had helped start. Pulitzer's paper sold more copies than ever. The circulation battle with Hearst continued unabated, with both newspapers competing to see who could be more jingoistic, more sensationalist, more disconnected from reality. Joseph Pulitzer had helped start a war. Thousands are dead, and his newspaper was more profitable than ever. But something broke inside Pulitzer. By 1900, his health was collapsing. His eyesight, never good, was failing rapidly. He was going blind. But worse than a blindness was what doctors at the time called shattered nerves. Today we might call it a combination of severe anxiety, depression, and possibly autism spectrum sensitivity to sensory input. Pulitzer became hypersensitive to noise. Not just loud sounds, any sound, the rustle of newspaper, footsteps, voices, the creak of floorboards. Sounds that most people barely noticed became physically painful to him. He would scream at servants for walking too heavily. Guests were forbidden to speak above a whisper. His own children were kept away because their normal childhood noise was unbearable. His family later said that he could hear a pin drop 3 rooms away and that the sound would send him into a rage. This wasn't metaphorical. He genuinely seemed able to hear sounds others couldn't and found them agonizing. Modern doctors have suggested he may have had hyperacusis, a hearing disorder that makes ordinary sounds painfully loud. The stress of running the newspaper empire was also destroying him. He couldn't see to read his own papers anymore, so he had to rely on secretaries to read everything to him. But he couldn't trust anyone. He was convinced his editors were plotting against him, that Hearst was bribing his staff, that everyone was stealing from him. He fired people on suspicion, then rehired them, then fired them again. His paranoia was legendary. And somewhere in all of this, Pulitzer seemed to have a crisis of conscience about what he had built. He had spent years justifying yellow journalism as serving the common man. But the Spanish-American War had revealed what that really meant. The press had become so powerful it could drag an entire nation into war based on lies and sensationalism. Pulitzer had helped create a monster, and he couldn't control it anymore. In 1901, he officially retired from day-to-day management of the World, though he continued to send detailed instructions from wherever he was hiding from noise. He spent the rest of his life running from sound, building mansions designed as fortresses against the world. Chatwold was one of those fortresses. Pulitzer purchased property in Bar Harbor, Maine, in 1895 and began constructing a massive summer estate. Bar Harbor was fashionable among the wealthy. The Vanderbilts, Morgans, and Astors all had cottages there. But Pulitzer's estate was different. It wasn't designed for entertaining or displaying wealth. It was designed as a refuge from the noise that was slowly driving him mad. The mansion itself was substantial, over 50 rooms spread across multiple buildings. But what made Chatwold unusual was the obsessive attention to soundproofing. Walls were built with special insulation. Windows were triple-paned. Doors had rubber seals. Pulitzer's private suite was in the center of the house, surrounded by empty buffer rooms that served no purpose except to distance him from any outside sound. The servants' quarters were in a completely separate building, connected by an underground tunnel so that staff wouldn't have to walk outside where Pulitzer might hear them. The stables were positioned as far from the main house as the property allowed. Even the location was chosen partly for its isolation. Pulitzer's estate was on a remote part of the island, away from the other mansions in the town. But no amount of construction could create perfect silence. Pulitzer's secretaries left detailed accounts of life at Chatwold, and they're almost surreal in their descriptions of his obsession with eliminating sound. Servants were required to wear felt slippers at all times. Rubber was placed under furniture legs. Doors were opened and closed with excruciating slowness. Conversations were conducted in whispers. Clocks were removed because their ticking was too loud. Even the turning of pages had to be done carefully. Pulitzer could hear the rustle and would scream if it was too loud. Guests were almost never invited. The few who came had to follow elaborate rules. No shoes, whispered conversations only, no sudden movements. Pulitzer's own children visited rarely, and when they did, they had to be absolutely silent. His daughter Edith later wrote that visiting her father felt like visiting a prison where everyone was terrified of the warden. Pulitzer himself spent most of his time in his soundproof suite, lying in a specially designed bed, listening to secretaries read newspapers to him in the softest voices possible. He would occasionally emerge for carefully controlled walks in the garden, but only when he was certain there would be no unexpected noise. Gardeners had to stop working when he walked by. Birds were a problem. He once ordered workers to cut down trees because the birds nesting in them were too loud. The isolation was total. Pulitzer had built an empire by shaping public opinion, by making the world louder and more frenzied, by filling millions of minds with sensationalist stories. And now he couldn't bear to hear any of it. The man who had created the modern media circus had become its most famous refugee. But even in isolation, Pulitzer couldn't let go of control. He remained technically in charge of the world, sending endless coded telegrams with instructions, criticism, and demands. His editors learned to decipher these messages and implement his orders, while also running the day-to-day operations he was no longer capable of managing. The relationship between Pulitzer and his staff became bizarre and abusive. He would fire editors on a whim, often based on something he had heard third-hand or misunderstood. He changed his mind constantly, contradicting orders he had given days before. He demanded loyalty while showing none, trust while extending none. One of his most loyal editors, Don Seitz, later wrote that working for Pulitzer was like serving a mad king. You never knew what would set him off. A story he approved one day would enrage him the next. An editor he praised would be fired within the week. The only constant was Pulitzer's conviction that everyone was incompetent except him, and that the world would collapse without his constant oversight. The truth was that the world was running quite well without him. The editors he had trained knew what they were doing. The systems he had put in place functioned smoothly. But Pulitzer couldn't admit this because it would mean admitting he was no longer essential, that the empire he had built had outgrown him. So he sent his telegrams from Chatwold and his other estates, convinced he was still in control, while his staff humored him and did what needed to be done regardless of his instructions. His family life was equally troubled. His wife Kate spent as little time as possible at Chatwold or any of Pulitzer's other residences. She found his obsession with silence oppressive and his behavior increasingly unbearable. They maintained the appearance of marriage but lived essentially separate lives, seeing each other only when social obligations demanded. His children were strangers to him. Joseph Jr. and Ralph were being groomed to take over the world, but their father's endless criticism and impossible standards made them dread the inheritance. Herbert showed no interest in the newspaper business and was largely ignored by his father. Edith, the only daughter, tried to maintain a relationship with Pulitzer, but found it emotionally exhausting. Constance and Lucille, the youngest children, barely knew their father. By the time they were old enough to remember him, Pulitzer was already lost in his isolation, more ghost than parent. They would be brought to see him occasionally, told to be absolutely silent, and then ushered away. It was not a childhood anyone would envy. The irony of Pulitzer's situation seemed lost on him. He had spent his career making the world louder, filling it with scandal, sensation, and manufactured outrage. He had proven that you could make people care about things that didn't matter and ignore things that did, simply by controlling how stories were presented. He had helped start a war by shaping public opinion through manipulation and lies. And now, having created a world of noise and fury, he couldn't stand to be in it. The sensationalism he had pioneered had spread to every newspaper in America. The techniques he had perfected were being used by everyone. The public's appetite for scandal and sensation, which he had carefully cultivated, was insatiable. But there's some evidence that Pulitzer understood what he had done and regretted it. In his final years, he began planning his legacy, and it didn't involve yellow journalism. In 1903, he announced a gift of $2 million to Columbia University to establish a school of journalism. The Pulitzer School would train reporters in ethical, responsible journalism, everything his own newspapers had not practiced. The initial reaction was mockery. Joseph Pulitzer, the king of yellow journalism, was going to teach ethics? The man whose newspapers had helped start a war through sensationalism and lies wanted to create a school of professional journalism? Critics called it hypocritical, a vanity project designed to buy respectability. But Pulitzer seemed genuinely committed to the idea. He spent years refining the details of the school, writing lengthy memos about curriculum and standards. He wanted graduates who would practice journalism as a public service, not as a business. He wanted reporters who valued truth over circulation, investigation over sensation, the public good over private profit. Everything, in other words, that his own career had not been. He also established the Pulitzer Prizes, to be awarded annually for excellence in journalism and the arts. The prizes would honor the best work in the field, measured writing, careful reporting, genuine investigation. Again, the opposite of what had made Pulitzer rich. It's impossible to know if this was genuine repentance or just reputation management. Was Pulitzer trying to atone for the damage he had done, or was he just trying to ensure he would be remembered as something other than the father of yellow journalism? The people who knew him in his final years suggested it was complicated, probably both. Pulitzer seemed genuinely troubled by what modern journalism had become, even as he continued to profit from it. He wanted to believe his career had been about crusading for justice rather than chasing circulation. He wanted the Pulitzer name to mean something honorable, but he never publicly admitted that yellow journalism had been a mistake. He never apologized for the Spanish-American War coverage. He never acknowledged that he had helped create the template for modern media manipulation. The closest he came was the journalism school itself, a tacit admission that journalism needed to be reformed, though never quite saying that he was the one who had broken it. In 1911, Pulitzer's health was failing rapidly. He was 64 but looked much older. Years of stress, isolation, and obsession had aged him prematurely. He was nearly blind, chronically anxious, and increasingly paranoid. His doctors recommended he stop working entirely, but Pulitzer couldn't let go. He spent that final year traveling between his various estates, never finding peace anywhere. Chatwold was too exposed to sound. His New York mansion was in the city, which was impossible. His yacht, the Liberty, was supposed to be quiet on the water, but he could hear the engines, the waves, the crew moving above deck. He ended up on the Liberty, anchored in Charleston Harbor, sending telegrams to his editors while slowly dying. On October 29, 1911, Joseph Pulitzer suffered a massive heart attack and died. His last words, reportedly, were about a story in that morning's world that he thought should have been handled differently. Even in death, he was editing. His funeral was a major public event. Thousands lined the streets of New York as his body was transported to Woodlawn Cemetery. Newspapers across the country published tributes, to his contribution to journalism. The World ran special editions celebrating his life and legacy. The same techniques he had pioneered, dramatic headlines, emotional manipulation, selective truth-telling, were used to memorialize him. What went largely unmentioned was the yellow journalism, the Spanish-American War, the sensationalism, the circulation battles that had degraded journalism for a generation. Pulitzer was remembered as a crusading editor who fought for the common man and established prizes for journalistic excellence. The darker parts of his legacy were quietly forgotten or minimized. After Pulitzer's death, Chatwold passed to his family, but none of them wanted it. The estate was too expensive to maintain, too remote, and too haunted by memories of their father's madness. It was sold within a few years to various buyers, subdivided, and eventually much of it was demolished. Today, almost nothing remains of Chatwold. A few outbuildings survive, converted into private homes. The main mansion is gone, torn down in the 1950s. The elaborate soundproofing, the quiet rooms, the felt slippers and rubber-sealed doors, all of it is dust. The only evidence that Pulitzer's fortress against noise ever existed is some foundation stones and archival photographs showing a large, rather ordinary-looking mansion that gives no hint of the obsessive silence that ruled it. Bar Harbor itself was devastated by a massive fire in 1947 that destroyed many of the Grand Estates. The Gilded Age cottages that had made the island fashionable were largely wiped out. The area rebuilt, but as a more democratic summer destination rather than an exclusive enclave. The few surviving estates are museums or have been converted to other uses. In a way, Chatwold's disappearance is fitting. Pulitzer built it to escape the world, and now the world has erased it. The man who shaped public opinion is largely forgotten except for his name on journalism prizes. The estate where he hid from the consequences of his career is gone. Only the prizes remain, awarded every year to journalists practicing the kind of ethical, responsible reporting that Pulitzer himself rarely practiced. The Pulitzer Prizes are genuinely prestigious. Winning one can define a career. The journalism honored by the prizes is usually excellent. Investigative work that holds power accountable, beautiful writing that illuminates difficult subjects, photography that captures important moments. The prizes have become the gold standard of American journalism. But there's something deeply ironic about this. Joseph Pulitzer's actual legacy to journalism was not ethical reporting. It was sensationalism, circulation warfare, and the discovery that truth was optional if lies sold better. He helped create the template for what we now call clickbait, the understanding that emotional manipulation drives engagement, that scandal and outrage are more profitable than measured analysis. Every tabloid newspaper, every sensationalist news broadcast, every clickbait headline that prioritizes emotion over accuracy, they're all descended from the techniques Pulitzer pioneered. The modern crisis of trust in media, the fake news accusations, the difficulty distinguishing truth from manipulation. Pulitzer didn't invent these problems, but he was among the first to weaponize them for profit. And yet we remember him for the prizes, for the journalism school, for the late career reputation, laundering rather than the actual career. It's a stunning example of how the wealthy and powerful can control their legacies, how enough money and careful planning could transform a destructive career into an honored legacy. The Columbia School of Journalism that Pulitzer funded has trained thousands of excellent journalists. But it was established by a man who built his fortune on the opposite principles it teaches. The Pulitzer Prizes celebrate truthful reporting, but they're named after a man who helped start a war through false reporting. The contradiction is massive, and it's largely unacknowledged. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Pulitzer's story is that he seemed to understand what he had done, but couldn't bring himself to fully admit it. He knew yellow journalism was corrupting the press. He knew the Spanish-American War coverage had been irresponsible. He knew that the circulation battle with Hearst had degraded standards across the industry. But admitting this publicly would have meant admitting that his fortune, and his family's inheritance, was built on practices he now claimed to reject. It would have meant acknowledging that thousands had died in a war his newspaper helped manufacture. It would have required genuine repentance, not just philanthropic reputation management. So instead, he built a journalism school and established prizes and hoped that would be enough. He tried to create a better future for journalism without acknowledging what he had done to damage it. And because he was rich and powerful, it worked. The Pulitzer name was rehabilitated. History was rewritten. The next generation learned about Pulitzer the philanthropist rather than Pulitzer the yellow journalist. His isolation at Chatwold takes on new meaning in this context. Yes, he was physically sensitive to sound, but he was also psychologically running from the noise he had created, the sensationalist media landscape, the degraded public discourse, the understanding that he had helped create something monstrous. His soundproof rooms weren't just protection from auditory pain. They were an attempt to escape the world he had made, to find silence in the midst of the chaos he had unleashed. But there was no escape. The newspapers came every day, read to him by secretaries in whispered voices. The telegrams arrived constantly, connecting him to the empire he couldn't leave behind. Even at Chatwold, in his quietest rooms, he was still part of the machine, still sending instructions, still shaping opinion, still contributing to the noise. Today's media landscape would be recognizable to Joseph Pulitzer. The platforms have changed, digital instead of print, social media instead of newspapers. But the techniques are the same. Sensationalist headlines designed to provoke emotion. Stories selected for engagement rather than importance. Truth as one option among many, to be deployed only when it's useful. The connection between media and war that Pulitzer helped establish is still strong. Modern wars are still justified through media campaigns that manipulate public opinion. False or exaggerated threats are still used to generate support for military action. The press is still more likely to amplify government claims than to question them, especially when war sells papers or gets clicks. We live in the world Pulitzer helped create, a world where the loudest voice wins, where emotional manipulation is more effective than rational argument, where the line between news and entertainment has essentially dissolved. We call it different things now: the attention economy, the outrage cycle, algorithmic amplification, but the fundamental dynamic is the same as yellow journalism. Give people what gets a reaction and profit from their engagement. And just like Pulitzer, the modern media moguls who profit from this system sometimes fund journalism schools and establish awards for ethical reporting. They donate to charity, support important causes, and present themselves as responsible stewards of public discourse. They hope, perhaps, that philanthropy will redeem the damage their actual business practices cause. Maybe it does. Maybe the journalism schools matter more than the sensationalism that funded them. Maybe the Pulitzer Prizes have done more good than Pulitzer's newspapers did harm. Maybe legacy is about the final outcome rather than the path taken to get there. Or maybe we're just telling ourselves comfortable lies, the same way Pulitzer did. Maybe we want to believe that good can come from evil, that destructive fortunes can be redeemed through charitable giving, that the ends justify the means. Maybe we need that belief because the alternative, that some damage can't be undone, that some fortunes are irredeemably tainted, is too uncomfortable. There's a photograph of Joseph Pulitzer taken late in his life that appears in many history books. He's sitting in a chair, wearing a dark suit, his face gaunt and tired. His eyes, nearly blind by this point, stare somewhere past the camera. He looks haunted. That photograph was probably taken at Chatwold, in one of the quiet rooms he had built to escape the world. And looking at it, you can see the cost of everything he achieved. The fortune came at the price of his health. The power came at the price of isolation. The legacy came at the price of truth. He got everything he wanted and lost everything that mattered. He shaped how millions of people thought, and he died afraid of noise. He built a media empire, and he spent his final years hiding from it. He created prizes for journalistic excellence while profiting from journalistic malpractice. He wanted to be remembered as a champion of truth, and he deserves to be remembered as a pioneer of lies. Both things are true, and maybe that's the real lesson of Chatwold and the Pulitzer story. That humans are complicated, that careers can be both destructive and constructive, that legacies are what we choose to remember rather than what actually happened. Joseph Pulitzer built a mansion where he could hide from the world, but he couldn't hide from what he had done. The noise he was trying to escape wasn't just sound. It was conscience, guilt, the understanding that he had helped make the world worse. The soundproofing didn't work because the loudest noise was coming from inside. And in the end, all the philanthropy, all the prizes, all the careful legacy management couldn't change the fundamental truth. He had learned to control what people thought, and he had used that power primarily for profit rather than truth. He had helped drag America into an unnecessary war. He had degraded journalism for a generation. He had pioneered techniques of media manipulation that are still destroying public discourse today. The Pulitzer Prizes are awarded every year with great ceremony. The journalism school continues to train reporters. The name carries prestige and honor. But somewhere underneath all that respectability, there's still the truth about how the fortune was made and what it cost. Chatwold is gone, demolished and forgotten. But the legacy lives on. Not the one Pulitzer tried to create through philanthropy, but the real one, the one written in sensationalist headlines and manufactured outrage and wars started on lies. That legacy is alive and well, growing stronger every day, shaping our world just as surely as Pulitzer shaped his. The mansion fell, the empire remains, and we're all still living in it, whether we know it or not.